Evening, everyone, and welcome to our family support group. Tonight, what I'm going to be focusing on are warning signs and behaviors of relapse. This was studied a while ago, and Terence Gorski was the first to actually see that a relapse just doesn't happen. It happens over time. An addict won't just pick up. So, I'm going to discuss a few things, and if you have any questions, please raise your hand, and Christian, step in if you want to say anything as well. So if we go to our first slide. Are we there? Next one. You're on mute. Okay. Getting clean involves a lot more than just putting down drugs and alcohol. Okay, and I think this is important. Recovery involves a lot of soul searching, emotional work, introspection, and an entire perspective change. And this is important to look at because when people come into treatment, they still talk about the drugs and the alcohol, but the drugs and the alcohol aren't in treatment. Your loved one is in treatment. So they are the problem. Drugs and alcohol will always be there, but they have a problem of addiction. And this is what we're trying to get across. It's not a specific drug, it's across the board, alcohol and drugs as well. And yeah, so if we can go to the next slide. Numbing with substances stunts emotional growth. And I think this is important because often from the time they pick up, that's where their emotional growth stays. And I think this is something that is really important because they don't mature emotionally and they need to catch up. And this causes the moral compass to malfunction. Removing the chemicals from the body is the first step, but it doesn't fix years and years of maladjustment to life, and this is what we look at because they just, don't just pick up. Yeah. Anything there?
I just want to, absolutely jump in there. I think we don't recognize, firstly, obviously, with the brain, how much substances affect the brain and development. But this is not just the brain, this is emotional development, this is social development, how to be in a family space, in a social space. If someone started drinking or using drugs or smoking weed or whatever it is at, let's say, 13 years old, very often their emotional development is stuck at that age. Basically what Clive is saying now, that so much of the malfunction comes from not being able to grow up, if we want to put it in those terms. And it's so important that this is where some of these maladjustments come in and this malfunction come in, because we're trying to fix and develop people up to the age that they're at. This is a quick fix.
Yeah, and I think what's important is we try and get them to grow up, to become adults, to start adulting, and from an emotional point of view, and this is something that their behaviors, often I've heard it say that that's my husband or my wife is my eldest child. And I think that's what we look at, is we want to build them up emotionally. And it does take time, it does. And this does take a lot of soul searching as well. If we could go to the next slide. Okay. To be truly healthy and whole in recovery, addicts and alcoholics need long-term therapy and support, and a willingness to change behaviors and defective thought patterns. In the NA Blue Book, it gives one promise, where the AA gives 12 promises, but the NA Blue Book says one promise: freedom from active addiction. But it goes on to say that any addict can stop using. The second part is lose the desire. But the third part, which is so important, is to find a new way to live. and that's what we're looking at here, is that needing to find a new way to live. Some people don't make these vital changes, and as a result, end up sober, clean, and miserable. That's why some people with decades of clean time are still angry, resentful, depressed, and hurting. And we often call that white knuckling. And in the next slide, you're going to see how we term this is our dry drug. If the person is clean and sober and is still miserable, they may be suffering from the condition known in recovery circles as the dry drunk. And even when they're in recovery, and if they stop doing stuff, they can go into a dry drunk syndrome as well and need to reboot themselves. And this is what we're going to discuss this evening. Next slide. Okay, so what is a dry drunk syndrome? It's people use alcohol and drugs addictively for many reasons. General predisposition to substance dependence, trauma, social conditioning, home environment, inability to cope with life circumstances, and negative core beliefs about themselves. And I think that's key, is often people coming into treatment have such a low self-worth and low self-esteem. And their core belief about themselves is so low. And it's tough, we need to build them. So, each day clean for an addict or alcoholic is like a miracle. And we encourage that because this is a Just for Today program.
Absolutely, Clive. I think if I can just jump in there, the negative core beliefs, and when we say that, they come in at their lowest point, because some of these things, as you can see, some of these things have nothing to do with the drug or the alcohol or the substance. So whatever it is, the home environment, the trauma, the negative core beliefs, this is all the stuff underneath that they're trying to deal with, to cope with, to numb, to avoid with using. So absolutely, as we go on, we'll explain that it's got nothing to do with the alcohol or the drugs, actually.
No, it doesn't. For many people who suffer from addiction, drugs and alcohol are the temporary solution. And I want to emphasize that to these problems before they became the bigger problem. So they'd use it to say, whoa, this is solving my problem. This is taking away my stress. I don't think of that trauma. But as they continue, their lives become controlled by the drugs and alcohol, and that becomes the bigger problem. And I think that's important to know. And for this reason, simply quitting substances without changing one's lifestyle or other behaviors and thought process is simply not enough. It isn't. And that's important. Taking away the substances doesn't fix the problem. And, this is what we often say. You're in here, not the substances. You're the problem. And that addicts or alcoholics are trying to solve their problems through substances in the first place. They believe that that would solve their problems. So their go-to whenever there's crises or trauma or pain is to the drugs and the alcohol. That's their way of dealing. And as they, come around and they get clean again, there's a lot of remorse. There's promising I'll never do it again. It was the last time, and all those things. So, we look at that all the time. And we need to understand and try and get to what's behind the drugs and the alcohol. Anything from your side there, Christian?
No, I think, Clive, it's really self-explanatory, because I think it's important when people come in and they say, no, but my son has stopped drinking before, he stopped on his own, but it didn't work.
And I think
stopped for a few months, a few years, but it didn't work.
And we often get people that come in and say, no, I've been clean for 3 or 4 years. And we say, clean from everything? Has there been weed? Has there been alcohol? And there's a big difference in being clean and being in recovery. And this I want to emphasize. You can be clean and you will have the dry drunk syndrome. In recovery, you're going to change behaviors. And I think that's what's so important here.
Because it is a behavioral disease, those are the things that need to change. And that's what we emphasize in primary treatment, in long term. This is the thing that we need to change, because your substances are gone now. All you have left is you and what your behaviors are like, what comes up for you, and that's what we work on.
For sure, that's so important. It says here, when someone doesn't replace their addiction with healthy patterns of living or a new way to deal with life, they can end up feeling empty, discontent, and full of anguish. And a lot of times we look at the disease of addiction as a hole in the soul, that something needs to be filled. It's disease of more. They're wanting to fill it all the time. And that's something we look at, and that's what we refer to as the dry drunk. It's the addict to alcoholic with no drugs or alcohol, but no solution. And not having a solution keeps them miserable. And a lot of them will say, well, why did I give up? And, I often say to some of the patients, do the program. Do all 12 steps. Really, if you can commit to 365 days, complete all 12 steps, and at the end, we'll refund you your misery. Because we know that working the program and working with, in outpatients and therapy, they're not going to be miserable. They will find solutions. They find a purpose to their life. They find hobbies, all that.
For some, I think it does take longer than others. For some, it obviously depends on all those things we mentioned before, the trauma, the social environment, all of those things. But the problem is that this assumption that without the drugs and without the alcohol, they're fine, they're clean, and it's okay, is absolutely detrimental, because it's wrong. It's not that they'll be fine if they're clean. And I think that's the point we're trying to emphasize. The feeling of emptiness, discontent, irritable, those things still come up, and they still don't know how to deal with them. So they might be clean, but it won't work forever.
No. And it's a temporary, and that's why, after, 5-10 days in treatment, I'm feeling great. I've got this, we hear. And that's scary as well, because no one's ever got it, and it's not an intellectual program. It's an emotional thing. And it's to actually start feeling, because so many feelings were blocked with drugs and alcohol that at that emotional stage, they don't know how to feel. And when feelings happen, it's scary, So recovery from addiction isn't just the absence of substances, but rather a way of life. When using and drinking are someone's entire way of life, they will probably need a new lifestyle when they decide to get sober. And this is scary as well, because addicts and alcoholics don't like change. They're resistant to change. And we've got to do it in a slow process so that they can see that they can get a new lifestyle. And I think what comes up here is otherwise the pain, fear, emptiness, drugs and alcohol returns, and the individual ends up suffering through abstinence or returns to active addiction. And I think that's what we're trying to emphasize, change is important, and change is a process, it's a journey. We often say to our patients, this is a journey, not a destination. It's a marathon, not a race. They want to get there, but there's nowhere to get but to get to themselves, and for themselves to.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of the things that we hear is people who've just been inactive for too long. They've been in it, their lives have been managed by it and controlled by it for so long that they don't even know where to start. They think that, well, why should I stop, because I'm just going to be miserable. And
Mm,
that's the changed behavior comes in, because
mm,
they only know a certain life, and this is where we guide them, show them a different way in recovery, show them that recovery has to come first, and the
mm,
behaviors with that, because learning a new way of life, getting rid of something doesn't mean that you know how to live a sober life and
yeah,
and be a functional human in society.
yes.
I think that's also what's important, because the emptiness, the fear, that will all come back if you don't have something new and something that you actually feel driven by to
Mm,
go for it. Yeah.
mm. And it's like working towards, often I say to, I've said to sponsees and that in the past, we all have the daily readings. If they just put a marker in their clean date of that daily reading, and they take another marker, and each day they do the reading clean, they'll see that it gets closer and closer to their clean date, and it also motivates them. I'm another day clean. I'm, 140, 160, 200 days. This is exciting for the
Mm,
addict to know that that's the miracle, to count the days and make the days count as well. You
absolutely.
know, like any affliction, dry drunk syndrome affects individuals in different ways. This can be avoided and corrected through different methods. The risk factors for developing dry drunk syndrome include social isolation, lack of emotional support, disengagement from the recovery programs, such as the 12-step fellowship, recommended treatment and aftercare programs, uninvolved in therapy, not treating co-occurring disorders. And we'll go through that, a lack of healthy coping skills and unaddressed resentments and anger. And we often say that the co-occurring disorders need to be looked at, and that we usually often identify in the primary treatment, which is so important as well.
Absolutely. Because as much as the recovery program, Clive, is, like you mentioned, the fellowship, the long-term treatment, the fact of the matter is a lot of the patients that come in have co-occurring disorders. They have underlying things that the substances may have triggered. They need to be on specific medication in order to even start at looking at their behavior. So that's also a really
Correct.
important.
Because a lot of the problem with co-occurring disorders is they self-medicated with the drugs and alcohol. They thought in the beginning that would solve the problem.
Mm,
So it's to go get through that as well. And I think a big one as well, and we often say it, unaddressed resentment and anger. You know, people that hold on to resentments and anger will eventually drink or use again. They need to be able, because that there's no justifiable reason for having so much resentment and anger, and to be able to deal with it in a healthy way.
mm. Because I mean, Clive, just to speak to your point, if I continue to insist on resenting my father, perhaps,
Mhm.
I will always have a reason to drink or to use drugs. I will always have something that, in the I don't know if it's AA or one of the books, they talk about these any excuses that we will use to
Mm.
use again, to drink again. And if the time comes where all of these things have accumulated, I've started to isolate, disengage from everything, I'm not asking for help, I'll just remember this resentment and be like, yes, it's my
Mhm.
dad's fault. Now I have something to use. So not
Yeah, of
addressing that only keeps me sick. And that's
course.
something that we always talk about with
Mm.
resentments. Yes.
Because that's what they will tend to go back to. And it's often what I try and work with a lot of the patients with is, what is it costing you holding on to that versus the benefits of letting go? So it's a cost-benefit ratio as well, which I think is important there as well.
Mhm.
You know, because addicts come in with a lot of hidden anger. You know, there's a lot of masked anger as well. And it's to work through the anger, because anger is a healthy emotion if it's dealt with in a healthy way,
Mm,
you know.
absolutely.
Yeah. So for many people who suffer from addiction, drugs and alcohol are the temporary solution. These problems, before they became bigger problems. For this reason, simply quitting without changing our lifestyle or our behavior and thought process simply isn't enough. Taking away the substances doesn't fix the problem that the addict or alcoholic was trying to solve through the use of those substances in the first place. It's like, let's look at the problem. Let's look at the anger to dad, the anger to mom, you know, all those things. Let's look at, and what's it costing? You know, what can you do about it? Because you can carry on blaming or you can change. And I often say, if you change the way you look at things, and this is a Wayne Dyer quote, the things you look at change, you know, which is so important. So it's having a different
Absolutely.
perspective.
I think on your point, I wanted to bring in what we spoke about earlier in terms of this being a process, in terms of this being long-term journey forever. Because the problem with this is that, yes, in primary, let's say 3 weeks or a month, we can't really go here. And this is
No.
why long-term, this is why the journey about aftercare programs, about long-term support and long-term treatment, because at this point, when they just come in, we're breaking denial, we're trying to settle them, allow their bodies, their minds, their space to adjust to not using. There's so much that goes on in primary that we can't, oftentimes it's really difficult, and maybe just before they leave primary, we're going to the resentment, going to the traumas, these things that they're holding on so tightly to, that only in a long-term treatment, only in a secondary space will they be able to say, sure, I've been using this excuse to keep using. They start landing, they start going there to their resentments. And I just
Yes.
wanted to add it in there that in 3 weeks, we've taken away their substance, fine, but it doesn't fix the problem. So I just wanted to add in there that the journey is important.
And it is so important, you know, that they do something after primary, either doing the outpatient, doing secondary. You know, it's so important for them because, you know, they've looked at it that people that just do primary have a 4% chance, you know, and that's scary. When they take longer, their chances actually go and grow.
Mm.
You know, and this is the thing, it's like they want instant gratification, so they feel that the drugs give them instant gratification. As soon as they're feeling slightly better, I've got this, I know what to do, and out they want to go again. Yeah. So when someone doesn't replace their addiction with a healthy pattern of living or a new way of dealing with life, they can end up feeling empty, discontent, and full of anguish, which we mentioned before. And that is what is referred to as the dry drunk. It's an addict or alcoholic with no drugs or alcohol, plus no solution. They often will stay in toxic relationships, different home environments, being dishonest about cravings and feelings. I think this is important because often with addicts, as we go on, you know, they need to change. You know, if they're in a codependent relationship, they need to put in boundaries. They can't remain in a toxic environment. They can't remain in an unhealthy home environment, you know, because if that's what's the problem, We need to remove them from that problem, and that's important. And I think the big thing as well is the dishonesty. You need to start getting truthful about you. Often when a person, what we call, refuses hospital treatment or wants to RHT, deep down they're craving. Deep down, they're wanting to run from something. And we often say, don't give up 5 minutes before that miracle happens. And that's important there.
Absolutely. Because I mean, if we go back to the heading of this is the stuff to be aware of before a relapse happens.
Correct.
All of these things can start to happen long before they pick up. They might be scared to tell you, perhaps as the family, that, guys, today's a hard day. I've been craving. I don't know what to do. They might be scared to do that for whatever reason, or not to trigger you guys, not to worry you. They might not ask for help. Again, with being dishonest, they'll be like, no, I'm fine, go home and be miserable. And this accumulates, and they end up relapsing. So all of these things really just play hand in hand.
And it's so lovely when we're in groups often and we see body language, and we do that check-in with feelings, and they say calm, and we say, but you're being so dishonest with yourself there, because we can see what you're holding on to. Okay, so engaging also in outside behavioral addictions, such as, and these are what we call our co-addictions: compulsive gambling, shopping, sex, body dysmorphia, and that we go with gymming. All the eatings, from purging, etc., are really important. High risk behaviors, especially with adrenaline junkies, still driving recklessly in fast cars, and all these factors can cause a sober person to fail to address their core issues, or the emptiness that fuels the result from the addiction. So, we often say that addiction comes in various forms, and it's to watch how you can become addicted to even, binge watching, reading a book right through the night. Those are things where you can create an unmanageability as well. And I think that's what we often say is, look at your powerlessness and your unmanageability in these situations.
Absolutely. And look at it overall. Look at it like, sure, I've been really shopping online a lot. I feel like this behavior is becoming, and this is all boils down to that self-awareness we were talking about, the honesty. If I can be honest with myself and say, I'm really watching too much porn this week, or I picked up and I wasn't, I picked up my phone and I went there and I wasn't supposed to. I've been gymming a lot, or I'm eating a lot more, and being that rigorous honesty as part of the program, part of what I'm trying to do. When that starts going away, you often find that these behaviors come up, and again, failing to address some of the stuff that is coming up for them, not being honest about it.
It's so true, Christian. This is something that what we look at is that if addicts look for an external locus of control to make them feel better, what we're trying to show them, that it works from the inside out. When your insides feel better, the outsides feel better as well. So we've gone through, that dry drunk, and I'm wanting to go now into the stages of relapse, because relapse, as you said, is a process rather than an event. It starts in subtle ways and it increasingly gets worse, and there are 3 stages to relapse, and we often look at it. And often when they come back into treatment, if they've relapsed, we will do a relapse autopsy and see where it started. So the first one's our emotional, then it gets to the mental, and last is the physical. It's the picking up, the acting out, and it's important that we see this, because they're not just going to pick up that drink and drug. And they often say, well, I don't know how it happened, okay? But if we go back, we start to see it started off on an emotional level. And when we go to the emotional stuff, I'm going to take you through what we teach them and what you need to look out as loved ones, because this is what's so important. So the first phase is, as we said, the emotional. And during this stage, the person is not actively thinking about using drugs or alcohol. However, the emotions and behaviors may be setting them up for a relapse down the road. And I think this is important, is that they might not, but you'll quickly see like a behavioral difference, okay? And it's often, gently nudging. When was the last time you went to a meeting? Have you called your sponsor? Have you spoken to your counselor? Why are you making excuses about aftercare? All that type of thing. Why aren't you seeing your therapist? Because these are little things that start to set in. And addiction is a disease, what we call a disease of forgetfulness, because you forget where you come from if you become compliant. And we're going to see this as we go through the stages, So, yeah, the next slide. So the warning signs in an emotional relapse often include bottling up emotions. It's often what's wrong, nothing. You'll get that, or you'll get silent treatment, or I don't want to discuss it right now, or I'm tired. That excuse will be the bottling up. What we emphasize now, not going to recovery support groups, i.e. 12-step fellowships, your aftercare programs, your counseling, all that is important. Isolating from family and peers, often withdrawal, because we often say, and what we often talk to them about when they come into treatment is isolation is addiction, where connection is recovery. So if you start connecting, you'll get a far more thing, because when they start to isolate, an addict goes into, an alcoholic goes into their head, and that's a dangerous space. Because when an addict starts to think, their thinking is stinking, and that's what we say, verbalize it rather, okay? Poor eating habits, not eating properly, big changes in sleeping patterns, they need to have a balance in life, they can't do anything in excess, and I often will, lecture on this about an 8-8-8 principle. 8 hours work, 8 hours play, 8 hours sleep. You need to have that balance. It's important, okay? A big one there is focusing on other people and their problems. So if I can look at someone else and their problems, I don't have to look at my own. And I think we even see that in treatment, how people will so be fixated on someone else, or even when we're working with them, they fixated on someone else outside. We say, no, but they're not here. You're here. Let's focus on you.
Absolutely.
So
the amount of times that happens, especially this one, focusing on others, it's like, okay, sure, there's a lot going on, bring it back to them. And I mean, it's difficult in the family space, I think, for you guys, because you might also see it as, wow, they're so like attentive and they're caring and they're checking up on me, but you'll also get a sense of this is unusual, or this is not coming from a place of maybe genuine connection when you guys are supposed to talk, have your catch-up calls. Maybe this is coming from a place where they seem a bit off and they're actually avoiding their own stuff. They're being too invested in my problems. They're, and you can often pick it up in that way. So it's kind of a slippery slope for you guys when you're dealing with it, but I think it's also quite, it happens quite often for you as well, where you can actually see it. Yeah.
And I think what's important there, Christian, is even in treatment, they start focusing on, I need to see, my kids. I'm missing my kids. I'm missing this one. And what we're trying to say, which is so important, is if you focus on you and you get healthy, you're going to make your kids healthy. You're going to make your relationships healthy. And it's like, bring it back to you all the time, and not going external again. So, what goes on, and this is high levels of anxiety are really important to watch, okay? Anger, outbursts, and irritability, also important. Not managing emotional problems in a healthy way. They become intolerant, judgmental, defensive, experience mood swings. They don't ask for help. Poor self-care emotionally and physically can come into play. And that is, I talk about the 8, 8, and 8, and then you're not, their physical hygiene, all that, and not having sober fun or taking time for oneself. And I think that's important, because when they start to go to meetings, people start to laugh, there's fun, there's hugs, there's enjoyment. And it's like, I've heard so many times in meetings, hello, I found my tribe. I'm home, and to give it a chance, which is so important there. And it's important to have fun. To prevent relapse, it's crucial to recognize that this is an emotional relapse, and it's important to immediately change. And this is what we say. And we often say to them, and this is what we teach, you need to change, deal with the feelings and ask for help, which is important. Implement deep breathing techniques. Denial is very common in an emotional relapse stage, okay? And emotional relapses can leave an addict feeling restless, irritable, and discontent. And that goes back to the dry drunk. Okay. And we often say to the addict, we use the word halt. And the word halt is hungry, angry, lonely, tired. And I put an S at the end of that, stressed. So if they need to check themselves, am I hungry? Am I angry? Am I lonely? Am I tired? And am I stressed? And if they can catch that emotional relapse will, they'll go back into recovery. And a lot of people can go through, and the longer they clean, the quicker they pick up their emotional relapse and the quicker they can change that. But if they don't recognize the emotional relapse and it's left, it builds up to become a risk in moving to the stage 2. And that's the mental relapse. The mental relapse can be best described as a war going on inside one's mind. And that's the I've been thinking, okay? The individual is at high risk for physical relapse. Part of them wants to use, while the other part doesn't, okay? But it becomes a battle, okay? You'll often hear, I'm not getting much from a meeting, it's not working for me. And they make a lot of excuses, and that comes in the mental. They start fantasizing is not uncommon here. They start reminiscing on the good times of using, but they forget where their addiction took them. And this is something it's sad, because if they do that proper step 1, they'll see the consequences. And if they do relapse, the actual consequences get worse, and there's more damage. And as an individual goes deeper into the mental relapse stage, their cognitive resistance to relapse diminishes and their need to escape increases. And I think I want to emphasize this, because addiction is the obsession of the mind and the compulsion of the body. And that's where the cognitive resistance is diminished, okay? And it's important to remember that occasional thoughts of using are normally in early recovery, but the thoughts that occur during a mental relapse are different. as they are thoughts of considering making an actual choice to use. And, you know, an addict will always sell and justify to themselves first the reason and go and use. And I think that they will sell it to themselves. And often, and excuse me, they sell themselves this bullshit and they land up believing it. And that's where it's because of my mother, because of my father, because there's some sort of reservation. And they will consider going. And if they don't catch this mental relapse, you know, lots of things can happen there.
Sure, absolutely, Clive. I think I wanted to also add in there because you mentioned they torn, you know, it's this war. And the fact of the matter is this disease of forgetfulness won't allow them to play the movie out till the end. We always say this to them. Oh, they're like, oh, but I'm thinking about using, but I don't want to. I don't want to do this. And I've got so many days clean. And you're like, what happened when you used? Back to step one. Clive mentioned if they did step one properly, your consequences are there. When you used, you're thinking on this side, it's like the good old days. It was fun. It was great, but it wasn't. It really ruined your life. Let's play that movie. Let's watch that. Because if you play it out, that's the part, you know, before we get to the forgetfulness, before this war takes over on this side, that actually those good old days were not so good old. It was not fun. And we have to just bring them back to that sometimes. So, yeah.
And I think what's important, Christian, is the delusion. Because the delusion is what puts them back into the denial. That they start to see it wasn't that bad. Or they start considering that they're not the problem, it's the drug or the alcohol. So I won't use that, but I'll go to that, which creates the relapse, and the relapse starts all over again. You know?
Just cycle.
Yeah, it's a vicious cycle. So in stage twos, often what we will see is, and these include cravings or physical and psychological urges to use, thinking of people, places, and things associated with that use. They start hanging out with old friends, you know, calling old friends. And this is where we talk about they minimize the consequences of their past using, or they glamorize the past, which I think is very important. They start bargaining with themselves. They think of scenarios in which it could be acceptable to use. So that whole bargaining comes, and often even can be bargaining with families as well. Lying becomes big, dishonesty, the thinking of schemes to be better control using. I can handle it this time. And they keep getting in the ring with Mike Tyson, and Mike Tyson keeps on beating them. You know, and it's important. It's like often, and I say it, you know, you tell a child the stove is hot. They'll touch it once and they'll burn themselves. You tell an addict that stove is hot, they will keep going back to try and beat the hot stove. And this is what we call the controlled using.
Absolutely. I love that metaphor.
Yeah. And often also they're not working a recovery. You know, it's important to remember that it gets harder to make the right choices as the pull of the addiction gets stronger. And this is definitely in the mental stage, because then the obsession becomes so great that the compulsion, the pain, is that they don't feel that they can deal with it, that they pick up. And I think that's where it gets the strength happens, you know, and you can still pull yourself out of that mental. But if you're not honest, that addiction is going to get stronger. Yeah. Okay. And the last stage, and this is the hard part, and that's the physical relapse. And this happens when the person doesn't take time to acknowledge and address the symptoms of both an emotional and a physical relapse. And that's your stage 1 and stage 2, and it's important, if you're seeing them not catching it in the emotional and they're going into the mental, you can still get help. You need the help. You can see what you can do, how you can step away, not to enable, putting in bottom lines, that might wake them up.
Holding your boundaries,
Yeah,
absolutely.
keeping those boundaries, and being able to understand that, yes, it does take time to trust. And, when we see the physical, and you might not see it because often the loved ones are in denial as the addict. But as soon as you get healthy, you are going to see it quicker, and you're not going to allow yourself to go there. And, this is what you're going to start seeing is change in appearance, weight changes, loss or gain, changes in appetite and eating patterns, sleeping patterns changing, up all hours of the night, sleeping in the day, very big. Mood swings, disregarding responsibilities is a big one. Isolation, the disappearance, and the poor hygiene will start coming back. And this is tough. This is where you need to really do an intervention and get them back into treatment, because it will just be a spiral out of control. And they will tell you, I've got this. I've got this. I know what I'm doing. I've got this. And, they say that when an addict says he's been thinking, it's dangerous.